Genesis chapter 8. You know what's funny? He mentioned the heat, but you realize he's like 2 foot taller than me? It's a lot warmer up there, I figure. I don't know this. I'll go get a ladder and check, but I'm pretty sure. It's okay to be tall. David lost. Sure. Okay. Genesis chapter 8. Starting in verse 1. But God remembered Noah, and all the beasts and all the cattle that were with him in the ark. And God caused a wind to pass over the earth, and the water subsided. Also the fountains of the deep and the floodgates of the sky were closed, and the rain from the sky was restrained. And the water receded steadily from the earth. And at the end of 150 days the water decreased. In the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark rested upon the mountain of Ararat. The water decreased steadily until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the 1st day of the month, the tops of the mountains became visible. Then it came about at the end of 40 days that Noah opened the window of the ark, which he had made. And he sent out a raven, and it flew here and there until the water was dried up from the earth. Then he sent out a dove from him to see if the water was abated from the face of the land. But the dove found no resting place for the sole of her foot. So she returned to him into the ark, for the water was on the surface of all the earth. Then he put out his hand and took her and brought her into the ark to himself. So he waited yet another 7 days, and again he sent out the dove from the ark. The dove came to him toward the evening, and behold, in her beak was a freshly picked olive leaf. So Noah knew that the water was abated from the earth. Then he waited yet another 7 days, and sent out the dove, but she did not return to him again. Now it came about in the 601st year, in the 1st month, on the 1st of the month, the water was dried up from the earth. Then Noah removed the covering of the ark, and looked, and behold, the surface of the ground was dried up. In the 17th month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dry. In this, did you notice what we didn't have? God never speaks. We have no record of God speaking during 150 days, during 40 days, and plus 14 days. Think about how long that is. 180 days is 6 months. You are spending 6 months on a boat. I don't know how many of you have. Just avoid it if you can at all costs. But spending 6 months on a boat with no word from the Lord. We don't even see the concept that the Lord was speaking to him because he sent out doves. So there's the Lord telling him, okay, wait, on this many days, it'll dry up. You can open up, you can walk out. He keeps sending out doves. He is personally checking. And in the middle of all that, God was still working. We started in verse 1, but the problem is, verse 24 starts, the water prevailed upon the earth 150 days. The verse from the last chapter, the last verse of the last chapter says, it had already been 150 days. And they're waiting on something. And during this whole time, we see that God was thinking of Noah. But God remembered Noah. God didn't remember Noah, and then instantly he starts talking to Noah and saying, hey, the water's going to subside. Don't worry. Just wait a little bit. This is how far you have left. In the middle of this storm, we only hear that God was thinking about Noah. And in the middle of this struggle where Noah is trying to use doves, and he's trying to use ravens, and he's trying to figure out, is the land dry? We know that God was working. Though Noah didn't know it, though we get this sense that he was trying to do it on his own, we know that behind the scenes God was still doing. God was still working for him. And when God started to work, it got worse. You ever have that? Sometimes when God starts to work in our lives, it actually gets worse before it gets better. Like things just start shifting. We're like, God, teach me patience. The craziest prayer you'll ever pray. And then you learn patience. sometimes when God starts to work, it doesn't look like God is doing what we ask him to do. That he's actually caring for us. Because imagine, you're on a boat for 150 days, and then God causes a wind to pass over the earth. So, okay, it gets windy. The water's receding, but the fountains of the deep are sucking in. The sky was closed, and the rain from the sky was restrained. Things were changing, but still no word. And if you're like me, once you get in trouble, you generally want the trouble to stay about the same. And right here, you see this shifting and changing. And it's not as though God said, Noah, things are getting ready, things are changing. He remembered Noah, and then things started to change. Things that were different. I mean, take it, you're on a boat, and the last thing you want is a windy day. You can't go up because now it's windy. This wind that is powerful enough to drive water away. We're talking Moses crossing the Red Sea power. A wind that does more than just blow on the top of the water, but actually moves water into the depths of the earth. And so what do we have here again? We have this storm. This extreme storm. And God still hasn't spoken to Noah. We're at, what, 190 days before we hear God actually speak to Noah. There's a famous poem. Most of us have actually heard it. Footprints in the Sand. Just the conclusion says, "You promised me, Lord, that if I followed you, you would walk with me always. But I've noticed that during the most trying periods of my life, there have only been one set of footprints in the sand. Why, when I needed you most, you have not been there for me?" The Lord replied, "The times when you have seen only one set of footprints is when I carried you." It's a sense where, I mean, we don't grasp the length of time here. It's hard to communicate 6 months of being stuck in one place and having no control. We talked about the boat earlier and last week. Do you realize it has no oars? It has no sails. There is nothing on this that is designed for motion. It just goes whichever way the wind blows. And the wave goes this way, boat goes this way. And there's no control. And Noah in the middle of this has absolutely no control of anything. And no one had experienced this up to that time. They thought he was crazy building this boat. No one believed him. There had been no rain. And then he gets on the boat and 150 days go by and not a word from the Lord. And if we are honest, this is where a lot of us get to. We will come to a point in our life where this is where it feels, we feel like God is not active. But in this set, we have already seen that God was thinking about Noah. Though he wasn't talking to him yet, he's thinking about him. Though he hasn't spoken anything to Noah, he's already starting things in motion. So that by the time he speaks to him, changes have already happened. There's dry ground. Verse 15. Then God spoke to Noah, saying, "Go out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing of all flesh that is with you, birds and animals and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, that they may breed abundantly on the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth." So Noah went out, and his sons and his wife and his son's wife with him. Every beast, every creeping thing, every bird, everything that moves on the earth went out by their families from the ark. Finally, we have God speak, and he calls them out of the ark. What a nice day. How many of you have been on a long car ride? Right? 3-4 hours, and you're already just sea legs. I don't know what car legs are called. You have car legs, I guess. But you know the feeling. You get out of the car, and sometimes you actually trip a little bit just getting out of a car because The ground's not moving. They've been on there 6 months, and he just got off with his sea legs. He sees the sun, because what had it been doing for so long? Raining. All you could see was rain. We know this effect here is driving through rain, and it just be so thick you can't see. He doesn't know where he's going. He doesn't know where he's been. He saw rain for 150 days, and then 40 days he at least had sunshine. But now he's getting to touch the ground. And God finally speaks to him, right? After God had been taking care of him that whole time, in the middle of our troubles, in the middle of our struggles, in the middle of where we're suffering, and we're like, God, where are you? Why aren't you doing something? Because God isn't directly answering us, but he was listening. He was caring enough to prepare things for him that whole time, so that he did get on the ground. And then once he's on the ground, the Lord finally says, go out of the ark. After he had done all the work in the middle of that darkness, man gets to be off the boat, out of the storm, and see what the Lord had been doing the whole time. And so the natural reaction, I would have probably kissed the ground, but that's not Noah's reaction. Noah's reaction in verse 21. Verse 20. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. The Lord smelled the soothing aroma, and the Lord said to himself, I will never again curse the ground on account of man. For the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth, and I will never again destroy every living thing as I have done. Most of us in here have gone through that darkness before. We have. And when we came to the end, we were so excited, and we lost it. But you see what? The Lord smelled the aroma. He smelled the soothing aroma. He received Noah's praise, Noah's excitement at having been rescued from a terrible storm, having been rescued from a boat that, yes, saved him, but at the same time kept him captive. He was in prison for 6 months. It's not like he could jump ship. He gets off and he offers this praise. And all of us are either at some point we are in that darkness in which God is working and God is working, and it may not have been that time where you can see God moved, but later you may go, oh, there was where God was moving and taking care of me. There was where God was doing something, keeping me safe, even though at the time I didn't understand or I hated it. And then we come out of that darkness, and most of us have. Most of us have been united with Christ, so that we now have the ability to give an offering to God, like love. A perfect example would be love. Because as unholy and as unperfect as we are, and how dark at times we go through, and we all do, if you haven't been through a death or a time where you were just lost and confused, then it's hard to understand how you came to God until you understood that. Because until we understand that we were in darkness, it is really hard to get to the point where we're, like I was saying, kissing the ground. I'm just excited that the Lord has given me ground now. That the Lord has finally been revealed to have answered all my prayers. God was working before he sent Christ. And before he received our praise in that darkness. And then God decides in 21 and 22. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. That's where God talked to himself. Do you notice it wasn't directed at anybody? It wasn't spoken to Noah. This was told to Moses from God because the Lord said it to himself. And we have God receiving this praise. And then you see God's love again. You see God responding and making promises again. We talked about that darkness, and then we talked about there was this light, and we have this light in Christ, and this chance of salvation, and this greatness that is to come, and where we can finally worship God because we finally see what he's doing. And then what does God include with all that? God includes his promises. Because when God speaks it, it's a promise. It's not like he's going to change it. If he says it's so, it is so. So in the middle of that, what do we have? We have darkness. Light comes into the world. We have the chance to receive it because we are just glad there's something besides the darkness. And then we receive the extra promises. How many of y'all figured out we're not talking about the flood? Okay. In reality, what we're really talking about is the sinful nature. Because this story is one that most of us are not going to fit into. I don't really plan on going on a boat the rest of my life. Sorry. I never want to see one again. I don't like boats. They have too much water and nothing else. And I'm okay with never seeing one again. And most of us are not going to be in a place where we're going to see a boat. Live on a boat for 6 months. That's a little crazy. But there is something here where God is actively working. And when we're just realizing how sinful we are, and it gets hard, and it gets difficult, and it gets depressing at times, we know that God is still working. Even if he hasn't come to you and given you the beautiful light yet, we know that God is still working. And when he reveals what he's been doing, it will be so great that we will just, Lord, how can I praise you now? How can I praise you? And the excitement of just knowing that there's something more than just this boat, this darkness, this storm. And then knowing that God has given us a promise. Baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you. Not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a clear conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. There is the promise. There's the promise of salvation through the resurrection of Christ. There is the promise of an escape from everything you deal with without Christ. Whether we're talking about the worst thing in your life, the most depressing thing in your life, it won't instantly be light. But if you have light in the middle of that darkness, it is better. And in this we have God giving us that promise right there. That salvation is offered in the light in Christ. If there's anybody tonight who needs to respond to Christ's invitation, who needs to be buried with him, united with him, so that you can have something more than this dark world. Something more than pain and suffering. Something more than repeating after repeating after repeating the same things. Our constant struggles. There's that promise again. The one that now saves you from all that. If there's anybody who just needs prayers, or if you want to be joined to this church, we ask that you come now as you stand and as we sing.